Prime Minister decides he will self-isolate after all.
We did look briefly at the idea of us taking part in the pilot scheme which allows people to test daily.
Boris Johnson and the Chancellor were traced after contact with a positive COVID case. They've now backtracked on their original plan to avoid quarantine.
The only reason that he's U-turned on this is because he's been busted. It's like bank robbers who got caught and now they're offering the money back.
Also on the programme, hope and fear ahead of England's so-called Freedom Day. As some businesses prepare to reopen, others plea for caution. A false start for Team GB's Olympic hopes, with 6 athletes forced to self-isolate after landing in Tokyo. And
absolutely unbelievable! Hamilton's wristed and they've made contact! A huge accident!
The F1 rivals on collision course as Lewis Hamilton wins a dramatic British Grand Prix.
This is ITV News with Duncan Golestani.
Good evening. The Prime Minister has been accused of double standards after the government announced he and the Chancellor were to take part in a pilot scheme to avoid self-isolation. This morning, Number 10 said they would take regular tests instead, despite being named as close contacts of the Health Secretary, who tested positive for coronavirus. But after a barrage of criticism came the U-turn, Boris Johnson promising to self-isolate at the Prime Minister's country residence. Labour likened it to a bank robber handing the money back after being caught. Here's our political correspondent, Romilly Weeks.
There are worse places to have to self-isolate than the Prime Minister's country mansion. But this morning, that was very much not the plan. In an extraordinary 24 hours after the Health Secretary tested positive for COVID and both the Prime Minister and Chancellor were contact traced, they initially said they would escape self-isolation by joining a little-known pilot scheme involving daily testing. A few hours later, they had a huge change of heart.
We did look briefly at the idea of us taking part in the pilot scheme which allows people to test daily, but I think it's far more important that everybody sticks to the same rules, and that's why I'm going to be self-isolating until the 26th of July, Monday the 26th of July.
However, not before a minister had been sent out this morning to defend the idea.
This is a well-known and long-standing pilot that's being conducted across a range of public sector organisations, including Border Force and TfL, which runs the transport network in London. Downing Street is part of that pilot, and it enables people to continue doing essential work only, being tested daily.
While most of us are basking in the sun, over 500,000 people are currently self-isolating and stuck inside. Families like the Andres, whose children are missing the end of term and delaying their holiday, expressing the anger of many.
When I heard that this morning, I just thought, how dare they? How dare they not follow the same rules that we're all following and that they've set? And it is just that sense of it's one rule for them and something completely different from us. Just like we're just little people.
Labour say the government have been caught out.
And the only reason that he's U-turned on this is because he's been busted. It's like bank robbers who got caught and now they're offering the money back. One rule for them, another rule for everybody else. It's contemptuous of the British public.
The timing certainly could not feel worse, just as the country embarks on the final stage of opening up. Those responsible for the decision will watch behind closed doors, a potent illustration of how fast COVID is still able to spread. Romilly Weeks, ITV News.
As Romilly mentioned, in just over 6 hours, nearly all COVID restrictions will be lifted in England. The legal requirement to wear masks inside will go, as does the need to work from home if you can. But as cases continue to rise, almost 50,000 recorded again today, there are concerns the change is coming too soon. Neil Connery has the details.
After 16 months, they're gearing up to reopen this Watford nightclub as England's COVID measures change tomorrow. Dubbed Freedom Day by some, for others one filled with fears. They say they've done everything to make clubbing safe here.
We are hoping to get 2,000 people walking through these doors. Monday the 19th, it's like New Year's Eve, Halloween, Christmas Eve, all together in one go. We cannot wait.
Wetherspoon's pubs in England will resume table service and relax rules on face masks. The chain says it will keep some measures like table screens and hand sanitizer stations in place. From tomorrow, social distancing is no longer mandatory in England. Face masks are recommended in crowded spaces like public transport. There's no limit on meeting up, but people are being encouraged to do so outside where possible. The government says the success of the vaccination programme has allowed the relaxation, with all adults now having been offered a jab. At this centre, the impact of the changes was on many minds.
The number of cases would probably say that it's maybe too soon, but perhaps everyone's ready for it.
Well, I'm pregnant, so I'm very anxious about it. I feel that pregnant women have just been left to survive the next couple of months, and I think it's a very concerning decision.
I think all the restrictions lifting does kind of make me feel a little bit anxious about it, but I'm still going to be wearing my mask. Supermarkets, well, obviously on transport we have to, kind of just making, common sense decisions.
Sarah Doherty has multiple sclerosis and is immunocompromised. She's worried about the effects on those shielding.
We've just been forgotten. It took a while for the updated shielding guidance to be posted on the government website, and it's very short-sighted. It's kind of assuming that we're not going to have a life.
Tomorrow's move is a gamble, but one the government says is justified by the science. Neil Connery, ITV News.
And for all the rule changes in England tomorrow and the situation in the rest of the UK, there is more on our website, itv.com/news. Well, Romilly is back with me now. Romilly, on the one hand, the Prime Minister is urging caution. On the other, being accused of wanting to avoid the restrictions.
Yes, and Number 10 seems to have belatedly realised that that is not a tenable line to tread. The government doesn't like to call the opening up tomorrow a gamble, which is certainly how some scientists see it, but they do admit that it's a balance of risk and they do need people to continue to follow the rules on self-isolation, which makes it even harder to believe that anyone could have thought that it was a good idea to have the two most senior people in government appear to have found a way around the rules. I've spoken to Tory backbenchers today who were tearing their hair out, saying that they had already had angry emails from constituents. In the short time that this idea lived, it really cut through. And the government has many tricky decisions coming up on vaccinating children, on how to relax isolation rules for organisations like the NHS, which are really struggling with the amount of staff who are being pinged, as well as this delicate balance of opening up at a time of rapidly rising cases. It is not a good idea to be eroding already fragile public trust.
Indeed. Romilly, thank you. ITV News has confirmed that the government will not vaccinate all children and teenagers. On Monday, it's set to announce that only those aged between 12 and 15 who are considered vulnerable to COVID or who live with vulnerable adults will be offered the vaccine. Police have released pictures of people they want to speak to in connection with the disorder at last Sunday's Euro 2020 final. The Metropolitan Police say they scoured hours of CCTV and video from body-worn cameras. And it probably won't surprise you to hear that today was the hottest day of the year so far. That summer heatwave continues to work its magic. This was Exmouth in Devon, but the capital recorded the highest temperature, 31.6 degrees Celsius. In Germany, Angela Merkel has promised to get help for the many thousands of people whose homes and livelihoods have been destroyed in the devastating floods. More than 180 people are known to have died and hundreds more are unaccounted for. Today, she visited one of the worst affected areas, a scene she called surreal and ghostly. Joshua Stokes reports.
After days of destruction, this is what's left of the German town Schold. Arriving to assess the damage, German Chancellor Angela Merkel commending those leading the rescue effort and calling for unity. I tend to say the German language has no words for the destruction that occurred, but what I could see was reassuring, how people are standing together, how they help each other, and the solidarity that is there. In Erstad, as the water subsides, the true cost is revealed. 28 vehicles were found buried here. Now all that remains is mud. Elsewhere in Germany, the clean-up continues. This is where Petra would usually care for her mother. We are just happy we're alive. My mother is alive, and that is the most important thing. Overnight, the extreme rainfall moved south. In Bavaria, flash floods swept through neighbourhoods, washing away everything in its path. My grandfather lives upstairs. He has been living here almost his whole life. He said he cannot remember it ever being this bad. The total number of people dead now exceeds 180, with hundreds still unaccounted for. Experts say climate change is to blame for these unprecedented weather events, but questions will now be asked of leaders as to whether this level of destruction could have been prevented, as towns like this across Western Europe start to rebuild. Joshua Stokes, ITV News.
Just hours after arriving in Tokyo, 6 athletes from Team GB and 2 support staff have been told they need to self-isolate. They've been identified as close contacts of someone who travelled on the same plane and has now tested positive for COVID. Well, Sangeeta Lau is here with me now. Sangeeta, terribly disruptive with just a few days to go.
It really is, and this is the news that no one wanted to hear, especially not the athletes that have waited a whole year to reach this point. It's a really difficult time. As you say, Team GB now have 8 members that are self-isolating, but the British Olympic Association say none of them have tested positive. They've all tested negative, not only at the airport, but again upon arriving in Japan. But it's a really difficult time. It means that the 6 athletes that have to self-isolate now have to be pulled out of training until they complete their isolation process. And this is kind of the news that many people in Japan were really worried about. They've held several protests against the Olympic Games going ahead during a pandemic. But the organisers, Tokyo 2020, say they are closely monitoring it since the beginning of the month. They've been recording the number of positive COVID tests across everyone involved in the Olympics and say that at the moment there's a total of 55 positive COVID cases there. Figures have been increasing steadily over the past 2 weeks, but actually yesterday there were 15 new cases and again today 10, and today the 2 first competitors have confirmed as positive COVID cases in 2 South African footballers who are now self-isolating. The rest of their teammates have all tested negative, but of course being closely monitored.
Sangeeta, thank you. Lewis Hamilton has secured his 8th win at Silverstone in dramatic style. In front of the biggest sporting crowd since the pandemic began, he collided with rival Max Verstappen. It led to the race being red flagged and the home favourite being issued with a 10-second penalty. Graham Stoddard was watching.
There was only one story going into today's Grand Prix, the battle between these two.
It feels like today is pivotal.
Max Verstappen on pole, home crowd hero Hamilton just behind. And it sure delivered on drama.
It's still not enough. This is absolutely unbelievable. Hamilton's risked it.
Hamilton's Mercedes clipping Verstappen's Red Bull, sending him spinning across the gravel into the tyre wall.
And in Max goes.
It prompted a red flag for only the 4th time in more than 70 years of Silverstone Grand Prix history. Verstappen thankfully walking away uninjured. It was restarted around 40 minutes later, Hamilton incurring a 10-second time penalty. But in an astonishing last few laps, he clawed it back. And on the same corner Verstappen came off,
Hamilton's going to try it in the same corner.
He took the lead, holding it to the finish, claiming his 8th Silverstone Grand Prix win.
There's a long way to go, but let's keep pushing, guys. I believe in you.
Graham Stothard, ITV News.
Finally, tributes have been paid to the comedian Tom O'Connor, who has died.
Ladies and gentlemen, Tom O'Connor.
The entertainer was famous as a host of many shows in the 70s and 80s. His family described him as a true gentleman. He was 81. And that is it. I'm back with the late news at just after 10 o'clock. Until then, have a very good evening. Bye-bye.